Hi, everyone. I know you can't see each other and I can't see you, but welcome um, to the March Madness version of reporting on crime, courts, and punishment. Thank you for giving up your seat in front of Sweet 16 to come and listen. People are trickling in, but I'm going to try to get this going because I'm going to try to fit in the presentation and then leave room for kind of like questions and also an AMA type situation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chandra Bozelko. I cover criminal justice. And a little fact here is that I actually didn't start in a journalism career. I was going to law school and I was wrongfully accused and convicted of some nonviolent crimes. I spent time in the York Correctional Institution, which is Connecticut's state women's prison. And I came home 12 years ago. And while I was in prison, that's when I started reporting on the conditions in the prison and things that I had observed. And that's how I became a journalist. I know that's a story unto itself, and I'm not trying to truncate it or evade any questions on it. I'm happy to answer them. I have my email on this first slide and my cell phone. If anyone has any questions, not only about the presentation or just about covering these issues, feel free to reach out. But also, if you wanted to ask me anything about my case, that's fine too. I'm very open about it. In fact, it's almost like my brand. So that anyone who ever wants to ask me about what anything about what happened in my case and how it relates to something they're working on or something that they've observed or even something that's happening to them or a family member, I am always willing to discuss that with you. So feel free to reach out. And this is being recorded, so you will get a copy of the session, and then also I will give my slides over too if that helps anybody. So you can get that information that way. So what we're going to try to do in, oops, let me see. Am I still sharing, Bella?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay. All right. What we're going to try to do is go through a lot of different things, but it's how you're going to present these stories. So we're going to go through the power of framing, who gets named in stories. That's a really big issue, especially if we're trying to cover crime in courts ethically. um, how to cover courts fairly and the proceedings that unfold inside of them to make sure that we are perfectly accurate. And then there are some like kind of more philosophical things like whose stories get told, what kind of sources are we using, that kind of thing. And then I have a couple of checklists at the end to make sure that if whether you're a freelancer or you're working in a newsroom, doesn't really matter how you can kind of check yourself and make sure that you're doing the absolute best job and the best service to both the people who are involved in these stories and to the community. So I just wanted to start with a few numbers. So the criminal legal system, that's what I call it instead of the criminal justice system, because there's actually a lot of debate as to whether or not it produces justice, but we know that it's a legal system. It's really decentralized and it's tiered. And to give you some idea, because I don't know where everybody else is coming in from tonight. I'm in Connecticut, as I said, but there is like a federal system, judicial system for criminal cases. There's 50 separate state systems. There's the Washington, D.C. system, which as a city has one that's kind of like a state, but it's also connected to the federal, so that gets kind of weird. There are tribal governments that have their own criminal legal systems. There's over 18,000 local law enforcement, sheriff's offices, local police, that kind of thing that make arrests. Then there are 94 federal judicial districts. So sometimes there's a combination of federal and state law that goes into them. So at a minimum, there's over 18,000, almost 19,000 separate systems operating every day, right? And within each of those jurisdictions, there's the trial level, which is the kind of entry level where arrests and, like where cases get worked out and where they're what they call resolved. Either there's going to be a trial and there will be a verdict or there will be resolution through, either the prosecution dropping it or the person entering some type of a plea. Then there's the appellate that looks over any mistakes on that at that first level, and then there's the supreme, and that's kind of setting the final level of law for whatever that jurisdiction is. So I want you to be clear, if there's three levels within all those 18,720, and not every local law enforcement jurisdiction has its own courts like that, so it's not even a hard number, but there are literally thousands of levels of systems that are operating every day. And then within that, thousands of cases. So that's how we have millions of cases that are going through in the United States every day, right? This is not a simple beat. It's actually massive, and the implications I think most people don't actually even understand. And so if you are taking on a crime beat or courts or something like that, or you're thinking about getting into it, or even if you're already doing it, you probably know crime beat coverage is incredibly and profoundly important. It actually can have the most impact of a lot of stories that come out in a news outlet, right? It can mean the difference between maybe a conviction or acquittal. Like if someone is deemed guilty of a crime or not, can walk away. It can mean the difference between freedom and prison. And it can mean the difference in whether someone dies in prison, not necessarily death penalty, although that's part of it. That's part of the conviction or acquittal, or comes home. And when I say dies in prison, there are a number of cases that are happening in courts that have to do with conditions of confinement. So they're actually after someone gets uh, to either jail or prison, and regarding either medical care, abuse, various things, access to the courts, things like that, that are being litigated in these courts. And they do have repercussions for the other criminal cases that are happening in those courts themselves. So for me, why I stay here is not only my personal story and the lived experience, but also because you can really actually make a difference in not only one person's life, but also in what the community, what policies are adhered to, which are jettisoned and said, this isn't right, it's not working, it's not constitutional. So it's really important beat as far as I'm concerned. And I hope that you come to understand that if you don't already know. All right, we're going to start first with the power of framing. So, for me, framing, how you frame the story, is part of being an accurate storyteller, an accurate reporter. So, I'm giving you two examples. They're hypothetical, right? I made them up, but we have version A and version B. And I want you to take a second and read version A and version B, and then I'm going to talk about it. As, oops. I have a very light touch here. Um, as you can see, version A, right? It just says that the story is that the police arrested someone, and the suspicion is this crime, stealing a car. Version B, someone is named, Marcus Webb, his location, where he is, his official address, and it's in connection with an auto theft investigation. All right. In the first one, I call it more passive because it's describing a crime, and it's not actually describing what the suspect did. It describes what the police did and what they did to the suspect. It talks about what the actual crime is and what basically the status of the investigation. Version B does the same thing, but it's different, right? We've identified a suspect, someone who's been detained, um, and it's the same, obviously the same case, but it is more specific, and in some ways, some editors say that this is better. However, it has shifted the subject. The subject is not no longer the crime. It's that Marcus Webb is at least suspected of committing this, or at least has something to do with it because the police detained him, or at least that's the assumption that people make. So I want you to think a little bit as we go through tonight, like what assumptions does each version of reporting a sentence like this carry? Like what are you imparting to the person who's to the audience, and also who benefits from the framing that you're using, right? I don't know that in this situation that there's actually someone that benefits from it, but I know there in version B there's actually someone who doesn't benefit from it, and that's Marcus Webb, depending on what his situation is, right? Like, so at the very least, even if he has done this, and the case will be, prosecuted and he is adjudicated either guilty or not guilty. He still has a life. Marcus Webb still has a life. He has something that he's doing every day. I don't know what it is because he's made up, but he has things that he needs to protect in his life, like how he's making his money, the relationships he has with people, and quite frankly, just with version B, that is placed at risk. Now, to be clear, a reporter, it's not your job to necessarily protect Marcus's life. Your duty isn't necessarily to Marcus, it's to the truth. But remember, telling the truth, because we don't know all of it from this situation, Marcus is part of that truth. And part of your duty is to him, not to protect him, but to protect him as part of a society that is owed the truth. So I just wanted to give those two different examples. And I also want to add, I don't think that either one of them is necessarily wrong, but I think there are probably better ways to frame things sometimes when we're writing quickly. I also want to point out that there is certain language that's been used often in the past, not so much now. I think things are getting better that deserve scrutiny. A lot of times especially in tabloids, the word thug is used. That's not great. There's some racial coding in it. You usually don't use it for white defendants. The crime-ridden neighborhood is actually, there's editorial judgment into a location that may not be entirely accurate or fair. The term fled the scene, right? That's really loaded, not only as to the reason why someone might flee, but there is a legal concept behind that, that if someone flees the scene, it means that they are, it imparts and implies, and there's actually can be what they call like an assumption of consciousness of guilt, not of guilt, but that of consciousness, that the person actually thinks that they're guilty. The phrase alleged victim, which is an attempt to be really fair because we don't know if like if the person, the victim in a case, if and the defendant, the person who's charged or being accused, is not convicted, we're trying to be fair, but saying alleged victim has the effect of maybe minimizing their credibility, like they're only alleging something and it kind of undermines their truth. There's a legitimate legal caution behind this, right? We don't like sometimes they say alleged defendant, but I think that there's a very easy replacement for that, which is to say complaining witness. If the person is involved in the investigation, if they're planning, if there's going to be a trial, if they're going to be testifying, if the victim, say the person who, in an example, whose car got stolen, in the Marcus Webb, the example I just gave you, um, is not participating in the investigation and didn't report it to police, that's actually part of the story. If the person who is being harmed by an alleged crime isn't somehow in the story, and they're still alive, it part of the story is how that situation, how that car, the theft of that car or alleged theft of that car got to the police. And that's a really important thing. So if there's a person who would be normally identified as a victim and they are not the complaining witness, i.e., they're not bringing the story to police, they didn't go file the police report, they didn't alert law enforcement, that kind of thing. The question there is why, and I think that's a very necessary part of the story if you're going to tell the whole truth. The word gang related is also unverified. A lot of times, we don't really understand gang mechanics and how they work, and there might be someone who is affiliated with one of these organizations or groups who did something that is actually not has nothing to do with the gang. And this is also in many jurisdictions something that enhances the crime. So if it's done for a gang purpose, it can actually be held, they can be sentenced more heavily later on. So this is actually, you're actually intervening sometimes into the story and making an assumption and adding a legal weight to what's happening if you report it that way without absolutely confirming that there is something that's going on. And then lastly, shocking crime. I know that that's another tabloid um, go to. I mean, a lot of crimes are shocking, right? Like we're shocked, but there are also crimes that may shock each one of us that would not be considered shocking to society for a variety of reasons. So I think that that actually brings in a lot of people's values, and maybe dictates to some people why they should be shocked or why they should be upset. So that's also loaded language that I think people need to at least check before they use it. But of course, using it in quotes, if that's what someone says, one of the people your sources says, then that's fine to keep it in the quotes, certainly. All right, who gets named? We just did the Marcus Webb example with the stolen car, but I want to remind you that naming is power, right? Withholding someone's name is also power, and sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. That's up to you. None of this in this training has to and is me telling you when you should or shouldn't do it. It's just me alerting you to what can happen when you're making these decisions and that you need to be careful about it. So when you are deciding who gets named, these are the questions I think you should ask. First, ask why. Why are you naming the person? Is it because they're charged, convicted? Were they just arrested because they were around the scene, when officers rounded people up at a certain location? What is the news value versus the harm to that person? All right. There's tons of situations where cops raid a club or they raid, some a street corner or something like that, and innocent people who are just there get dragged into it and get arrested and are brought in. Eventually, this gets, most of the time at least, this gets worked out. But remember that if there's, 13 people who get arrested in an area when the cops do some type of a sweep, question whether it's worthwhile to name absolutely every single one of them. If you have to name some, then you have to have some kind of system as to why you're naming one or the other, or some, not the other, that kind of thing. Just you have to, and also I would also say you have to do that consistently, right? It's not just random choices. And it also can't be motivated by some like, well, these sound like they may be names of minority defendants, so we'll leave those out to protect them, and we'll use, very typical names. That's not fair either. The question is, what is the harm? What is the person's real role in the story? And whether you really need to do that. Do you need to turn your story into what is essentially sometimes just a police blotter, right? And there's a lot of debate over whether police blotters are even worthwhile. I know some news outlets still do them, but a lot of them have also jettisoned. And the editors have said we're not doing this anymore because we don't know what's going to happen in these cases and we don't have the resources to follow them all the way through. Um, Question is, would you name them if they were different? So like if you're trying to protect any type of group, whether it's racial or ethnic, that's particularly bad. But even still, maybe think people you think might be students or versus non-students, all of that, those kinds of reasons, they have to be grounded in some type of ethical principles that your newsroom or you as a freelancer have kind of already adopted ahead of time so that you know what it is that you're doing, at least that you have some framework that you're operating from. Publishing a victim's name is a tricky situation, right? Especially in sexual assault cases and domestic violence cases. Domestic violence cases where there is a spouse who has children, that person, the children may be identified, kind of on the side from that coverage. If a lot of times you can ask the prosecutor to get you in touch with the victim and is it okay to use their name? If they say no, I would generally recommend that you honor that. But then there are also sometimes when if you're going to fully cover the story, say a domestic violence case actually goes to trial and that person is testifying in open court that anyone can go see and other reporters may be watching, it is I would say you're ethically bound to report that person's name, or at least somehow identify them so that it's not just a faceless accuser, because that's also part of the defendant's rights. But again, you have to have some rules and some framework that you're approaching the story with before you go into it. And even then, when you're covering it, there's going to be ethical kind of nuances that arise as you're deciding all that all the way through. There are a lot of resources online that you can go to and try to check. There's the ethics hotline at SPJ, but naming a victim or a complaining witness is something that should attract your attention as you decide whether or not this is something that you actually think is necessary for the story or it's ethical for the story. And lastly, what happens after the story runs, right? So this is something that the Gannett Network did a couple of years ago. They decided that if they are not going to be able to cover a criminal case from like the way they used to term it for court TV was gavel to gavel. So from the arrest all the way through till the case ends, whether that's through dismissal, a plea, a trial, whatever it is, if you're not going to cover it from beginning to end, then they weren't going to cover it at all, because then that would mean that it's not a newsworthy enough story. They didn't want to do just kind of sensational, this person got arrested, and then, basically use police reports as a press release and do a very quick story that they never return, and that it's not easy for the public to understand what happened to that case and whether that person was adjudicated one way or the other without having to dig into court records, which sometimes in some states and some jurisdictions are not online. So if I am wondering whether someone down in Alabama I read a story about their arrest and I wanted to know what happened with it. I can't even really go online for many of those places because they're not, it's not online, and I'd have to call the clerk and get copies of the case to figure out whether how what the resolution of that case was. And for me as a reporter, that's different. I that's what I do. But the average person, or maybe even an employer for that person, family member, anyone who meets them in a social situation, that's kind of information that they would want to have. And when we put it so far out of reach with the combination of the accessibility of court records and the way the press covers these cases, we have to remember that this is a real person who we're impacting. So that's another decision. If you are you going to go cover an arraignment of a very big newsy case, but if you're not going to follow it all the way through, or your publication isn't going to follow it all the way through, is that something that you think is ethical to do? Sometimes it might be. I'm not here to tell you that it is or it isn't, but I'm just saying that's something to keep in mind. All right, covering courts fairly. I want to remember, like, when someone's arrested, it doesn't mean they're guilty. What if they're arrested, it doesn't mean that they're convicted. And these words actually matter enormously, not just for the public, but also just legally, right? Remember this, we can have a lot of people who report on criminal cases can actually have an impact on it. And this is something that it's just the truth, right? You'll never read about this in any journalism case, journalism course or anything like that. I doubt that editors are going to admit this, but it's just the truth. When you are covering a case that goes all the way to the point that it has a jury trial, after the OJ case in 1994, 1995, courts are very loath to sequester jurors. They give them instructions that they can't look at news reports or discuss it or whatever. But the fact is, having been through a trial myself, too, and also just covering them and seeing what happens, jurors look this stuff up all the time. They just don't admit it. So when you are doing that kind of coverage, just know that it is going to get into a juror's head. The fact that they've read it doesn't mean that a juror is affected by that or that it goes into deliberations, but we can't unring bells, right? If I have read something about a defendant and I'm deciding whether he is or she is if I'm going to vote to convict them, to will deliver a verdict of guilty or not guilty, what I've understood about that person affects affects my perception. It's just no way we can get around it. And this idea that, well, jurors aren't looking at what's online or news stories, they're not supposed to, and they're not supposed to bring it into the deliberations. And I would say for the most part, they probably don't bring it officially into deliberations. They don't say something because another juror will turn them in, but it does affect how they understand the testimony and the facts that were presented to them. So you do have an impact on whether or not someone is going to be adjudicated or understood a certain way. So that's an important burden. It's a very serious burden, and people who take on this beat or try to cover certain stories in the criminal legal system have to understand that they are playing a role as much as they want to stay separate and not be a part of it, but doing their job can have an effect. So, just the legal ladder, getting the language right. So, arrested is the least problematic. It means that you were basically taken by police to a police station, possibly processed, sometimes not even all the way processed, but it's just it's the entry point, but it's also can be the least interaction that someone has with the criminal legal system. Things can be dropped then, it may not proceed. After the arrest, that's when the prosecutor gets involved and decides whether or not they possibly want to pursue this case. The initial assessment, am I going to pursue this against this person or not, happens right after arrest. Usually, it depends on the jurisdiction. In a certain number of hours, they'll decide, yeah, we'll possibly take this, but it's usually more like, no, this is a junk thing, or this is something that doesn't um endanger public safety, or it's not worthwhile for this office to put resources into that. And so they can be arrested and then just never hear from police or the courts again, maybe get something in the mail. But there are a number of people who got arrested and then never never knew what happened to the rest of the case because they never heard again. And they went to court to try to figure out what was happening, and there's no record of it. So that happens a lot. That might actually be a story in and of itself, is how we arrest people and grab them off the street, and then it just poof. There's like no one really can explain the reasoning why the state or the local jurisdiction isn't moving forward on the case. Charged is when the prosecution says, yeah, there's something here where we think we're going to take at least the first few steps in prosecuting them. So that's charged, and the case is on, right? As of that point. Hasn't been tried yet, but also may never be tried, right? Prosecutors decide to file charges and charge people, and then later on, as more of evidence comes out, or they really consider it, or they consider the ethics of proceeding on a certain case, they may drop it anyways. Indicted is actually that's a term that only applies in certain jurisdictions. Where I am in Connecticut, we don't do indictments. Where when you're charged, the prosecutor brings a piece of paper to a judge, and the judge acts like a grand jury and indict you, like signs whether or not there's probable cause, and the case goes. I know that's the way in a couple of other jurisdictions. In federal and other places, they have to go then to a grand jury and present to the grand jury whether or not there is enough evidence to proceed. It's a very low bar for grand juries to decide whether or not they'll continue a charge. I don't know if anyone's been watching what's happening in Washington, D.C. with a lot of the silly charges over people protesting ICE, and also some charges that the president wanted brought against some political enemies and people who had made statements about it was lawmakers who had made statements about people in the military following illegal orders. And the grand jury delivered what they call a no bill, which means they said there isn't enough evidence for the prosecutors to proceed with that. That's highly unusual. DC is a weird place anyways, but I would say that the number of no bills that the DC prosecutors have gotten in 2025, 26 is unusually high, right? It's most likely there's an old saying from a judge who actually ended up getting in trouble himself, that you can indict a ham sandwich because it's just a proceeding that very much favors the prosecution. They present their evidence. There's no countervailing evidence. There's no defense attorney protecting the person who's accused. So it's just basically like a one-sided story. Do you think we have enough? And most of the time, grand juries say yes, and the case goes on. After the grand jury, there's a lot of different things that can happen. The only time that a person is convicted, meaning legally, not necessarily factually, but legally, the person has committed the crime, is when they are convicted. And that can happen when they enter a guilty plea. We'll go over the different types of guilty pleas. Enter a guilty plea, or they go to trial, and either a court or a jury looks at all the facts and makes a factual determination that they have committed the crimes, and that the government has proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt, and they enter what they call a verdict, which is actually different than a conviction, but it's a factual finding. It's a kind of a checkbox, like, yes, there's enough evidence to prove that this person did this, and a verdict ensues. And then a conviction follows after that when the person is sentenced. So that's actually a really important point that I want to emphasize here, because when a jury or a judge says, here's the verdict, there's enough evidence that you, Mr. or Miss Defendant, did X, Y, or Z, that's actually technically not a conviction. All right. And this is a big problem with a lot of editors change this stuff, that it's just a verdict, and the conviction only happens if and when that person is sentenced. And a lot of times people who get a verdict and a jury or a judge says, yep, there was enough evidence, it works, this case works, there are reasons why it never gets to a sentencing. Either there's a new trial that is ordered, or there's misconduct that's discovered, or something else in between the verdict and the sentencing that caused it not to go all the way. So it's very important that you're very mindful of the difference between a verdict and sentencing. There are some jurisdictions where, because there is absolutely no discretion allowed to the court as to what someone gets a sentence to. A good example is in Massachusetts. If you're convicted of first-degree murder, you are going to get life in prison. So the court just kind of like dispenses with everything. It goes from verdict immediately to sentencing, after a few, statements by the prosecutor and whatever. So it can happen in the same day. In many jurisdictions, the verdict can happen months to a years before the actual sentencing, before the actual conviction enters. So just that's what figure out whatever jurisdiction you're in, how that works, where you are in the case that you're covering. Is it a verdict? Is it a conviction? And be very careful about that, the words that you use. I would also say just because if you have made a decision that you're going to cover a case like, throughout or at least beyond just the first stage, I would never label someone who is a defendant a killer, a murderer, a rapist, a thief. Use the alleged, accused, charged with, or convicted of, because there are so many people who it looks like, this, you're reporting on what's happening in the court, and that's what's happening in the court. And then in post conviction and appellate proceedings, it's found that this person is actually either factually didn't do it, or that there's a technical reason or procedural reason why the conviction is going to be vacated. So it's actually not accurate, right? Like, even if someone is convicted of first degree murder, legally it doesn't make them a killer, because that conviction might not last, right? And we're writing for history. We're writing, as the Washington Post once called the news, the first draft of history. So it's important to avoid those things that are going to actually come back later to possibly need correction or something else. So it's for you to protect yourself as a journalist and being as accurate as possible. All right. Covering courts, these are some common mistakes that I just wanted to highlight if those of you who are getting into this or considering it. Confusing a guilty plea with guilt is a mistake. Guilty pleas, they result from a lot of different reasons that don't actually include guilt. A big thing, if you're going to go into covering crimes in courts, is the trial penalty, which means that basically the courts, the entire system up to the Supreme Court, says it's fine for a person if a defendant is offered a deal, say if you plead guilty to this crime, you will get 1 year in jail, but if you take it to trial, all bets are off. You can get 20 years. That's called the trial penalty, and it happens all the time. It's almost guaranteed that if someone who decides to take a case to trial will have a trial penalty imposed. It's not an official thing. It's not like the judge doesn't say this is your trial penalty, but it's just unknown. It's just a common practice that judges say, if you are willing to put the court and the government through the paces of having to prove your guilt, then we're going to punish you more severely. And of course, this is supposed to incentivize people to quote unquote take responsibility early and enter a guilty plea on the record to get a lower sentence. There is one judge that I know of in the entire country. His name is Jed Rakoff. He's in the Southern District of New York, who says, I will never impose a trial penalty, whatever they're offered in the initial plea bargain negotiations. They will get that from me, because obviously the prosecutors thought that was an adequate penalty. So who am I to say? And I'm not going to punish anyone who wants to assert their rights. But that's one judge. And as I told you, how many systems there are, one judge has publicly said, I will not impose a trial penalty. Pretty much all the rest do. And if they're not doing it, they don't want to come out and say that they're not doing it, because they want to move business in their courts, and they want people to enter those pleas and get cases resolved and closed and get things moving. If you are covering a case, always report that something was dropped, right? If someone starts with 5 charges and they're only convicted of 2 after trial, or they only plead to 2, specifically say what charges were dropped or are not resulting in a conviction. That's really important for the historical record and also accuracy, right? That's what's happening in the courtroom. Quoting only the prosecution. This is actually a really hard one, because it's usually the prosecutors who want to talk to you, and they also have the mouthpiece of the courthouse and the judicial system that's behind them. But the defense perspective, it's not optional, but it's also, I will admit to you, having done this, it's really hard to get. The New Jersey Public Defenders Association, they won't let their people, the people who work for them, the attorneys who represent people in New Jersey state courts, who can't afford a lawyer on their own, they are barred from talking to the press. Obvious risk is they're afraid that, that something that they're going to say on behalf of their client is going to be held against them, and the whole organization just doesn't want to be put in that position where they may have jeopardizes their clients, collective clients, right? Clients of public defenders in the state, chances of either a better plea deal or of um, their chances at trial. That'll show you exactly how important um, press coverage is of these cases and these proceedings because it does have an effect. So in New Jersey, if someone, excuse me, is represented by a public defender, you're probably not going to get anything to say anything. There are other public defenders' offices that just in general, it's not a policy, but they will avoid talking to the press. So I'm not going to tell you that that's easy, but you should do everything that you can to try to get the defense perspective, even if that means diving into court records and pulling some language out of motions or something else. Doing that is crucial because the prosecution has such an advantage in this, both in terms of the relationship with the press and their freedom to say something, but also resources, right? There are people who represent themselves, who are leery of talking to a reporter for fear that they could either be misquoted or even if they did say something that isn't misquoted, that it can be used against them. So they're very leery, but there is always a way to get defense perspective somehow, right? Go to court and listen to what the defense attorney says on the record to the judge. That's open for anybody can hear that in an open court and write that down. So that there are ways to do it. Just ignoring it is probably not ethical. Um, Even if you were to say, I tried to reach, all these defense attorneys and everything else, list all of that out that you tried, but you couldn't get anybody to comment. But just taking the prosecution and the police's word that that's the only story is very much a mistake. It's not, it leads to very poor journalism and it also doesn't give you all the opportunities you need to be the best reporter that you want to be. I would say another mistake is treating sentencing as an ending. Like I said before, sentencing is when the conviction actually enters. So you can't really say that the person is convicted until they're sentenced. But that's actually in many cases the start of like the either the juicy stuff that's going to be happening in terms of figuring out how to undo that conviction if that's what the defendant wants to do, or also how they're going to be treated through the remainder of the system. Remember, that's the start of the punishment, the sentencing, right? In federal court, it's actually not even that because usually they give people a couple months to iron out their affairs. In state court, once you're sentenced, you're taken into custody immediately and taken off to confinement, whatever that happens to be. Um, Incarceration, appeals, exonerations, conviction integrity units, something called habeas corpus. It's very rarely the end of the story when someone gets sentenced and sent to jail. There's usually something more for you to cover if you have the resources to do that and your editor will let you. I also think ignoring systemic context is a mistake, right? Is this case typical? Is it rare? In those jurisdictions where the district attorneys are elected officials, which is a more majority, but it's not every single one, is the DA running for office? That's a big thing. A woman in Texas was sentenced to death. She's still on death row, but the execution has been stayed. Her name is Melissa Lucio. And at the time, the DA was both running for office and had just recently let a friend of his who was convicted of murder, um, 2 miles from the Mexico border. This was down in Texas, near in Brownsville. Um, let him out between the imposition of sentence and actually turning himself into jail, which again in state courts is that doesn't happen. It only happens in federal courts. And the guy took off and has been missing. I think he still is. And he's running at the DA was running at the same time, so this was a big black eye on him. He's trying to get these votes, so he basically cheated to get this woman sentenced to death for something for a situation that wasn't really a crime. Her daughter fell and they convicted her of beating her to the point that she died. So this is all of that kind of context needs to be put in to these stories to make sense of everything that is happening. Granted, sometimes it's not always that juicy or sexy as that, but I think that mentioning who the head DA is, mentoring if it's what they call a line prosecutor, that's usually a junior prosecutor. They call them line prosecutors. If it's a line prosecutor that either bucked what you would usually expect from that DA and the line of cases that they usually prosecute and win on, things like that, all of that I think is makes not only just for better reporting, but for more accurate reporting and a better service to the community, to the reading community. whose story gets told. So source diversity isn't just nice to have, it's actually kind of necessary to get to the accurate story. But there's also how you find those things. We're going to go through that. So in general, they've done studies on this. 70% of the sources in crime stories are officials or law enforcement or prosecutors or somebody who's affiliated or employed by the government, right? Less than 10% represent the affected communities directly, either defendants, even defense attorneys. They like how I explained, they generally are a little leery of talking to reporters. And it's three times more likely that white crime victims are treated better than black victims. And I'm sure you can understand the reasons why, but just wanted to give you that a few statistical points there so that you understand. Um, if you are telling a crime story or you're covering a case of a criminal case, expanding your source list, I think, prior to even jumping into this type of thing or while you're covering it, because these cases don't get resolved in a day. It's going to be months, maybe years. Expanding your source list while you're covering it or even before, I think is really useful. I think it's ethical, and I think it just also improves you and puts you in better stead to be a better journalist. Going beyond law enforcement, defense attorneys and public defenders. A lot of times, if the defense attorney in the particular case you're covering doesn't want to talk to you for the obvious reasons, go talk to other ones. There's a criminal law or criminal defense attorney group in every state. Usually you can find them through the Bar Association, but a simple Google search will turn them up. And they always have people who want to get their names in the paper, particular defense attorneys, because that gets them business. So that you're not going to have a hard time. You just got to kind of set it up ahead of time because it might take them a little while, a couple days to get back to you, and they're not going to answer you in a couple of hours if you're trying to make deadline. Criminal justice reform advocates. There are tons of organizations that out there that will, if their comms person got an email from you and said, "Can you have someone that associated, someone you just that your organization knows, you don't even have to employ them, that knows something about this type of case," I guarantee you they will find you at least three people because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get their voices out there and to give a different perspective. This is part of actually their fundraising so that they can be able to do that. So definitely go to criminal justice reform advocates and those organizations. I can give anyone a list if they want them. Reentry program staff, if it's something about either probation or parole or something like that, there's always a halfway house, something in whatever jurisdiction you're covering, and they have comms people too, or at least comms policies so that the people who work there know what they can and can't say, like if they're allowed to answer certain questions. Definitely a worthwhile investment of your time. Formerly incarcerated people are really big because they know the whole thing from start to finish. You can find them through the criminal justice reform organizations. And there are also now court watching organizations where they actually, because this is so important to have kind of a witness to the witnessing, right? Like the testimony is that there are court watching organizations cropping up in usually in bigger jurisdictions, New York City, Miami, places like that. But look and see if there's a one nearby, see what they say. Even if you can't talk to the one that's nearby, if there is none, if you're in a rural area or one that doesn't have it, call these organizations anyways and see what kind of quotes you can get. It's still going to give you a little bit of a counterweight to the kind of traditional law enforcement prosecutor line. So I think that's doable if you're going to talk about this. If you're doing a case where there's victims, especially if there's sensitivity around either victim identity, naming them, or, what they're accusing the person of doing. There's a big concept of the imperfect victim, like, where people who don't have ideal paths are accusing someone else of the crime and the way that that's used against them. Talk to victim advocacy organizations. There's a lot of them. I know that there's a domestic violence group in at least one in every state that you could go to and talk to them if it's a domestic violence organization. I know that there are several groups that are dedicated to the families of people who are murder victims. Talking to them, they can give you perspective. Um, Neighborhood associations tend to, in my experience, go a little bit more towards law enforcement. They're usually trying to protect their neighborhood with good reason and good cause, but they're still valid sources, right? Mental health and social services would stay away from state or government sources because they're not allowed to comment on individual cases like that. But there are, private organizations that do that. And then also family members, look, looking on Facebook, find the victim if they have any kind of social media presence. Are they listed as having family, cousins, things like that? Reach out to them and ask them if they want to lean in because sometimes, it's just too traumatic for a victim or the people very close to that person to want to weigh in and rediscuss this and rip open old wounds, after especially having to do that in court. But talking to family members it can be also very illuminating and it also checks the box for you, right? Like it shows that you're really fanning out and talking to a lot of people. Experts. Those criminal justice reform organizations will also know criminologists and researchers that you should talk to. Great place where they have a ton of people and researchers and experts is the Laura Arnold Ventures. It's the John and Laura Arnold Foundation. Look up Arnold Ventures. They abbreviate their organization AV. They have a ton of money and therefore a ton of people on staff who work on various aspects of the criminal legal system. They will be able to give you a quote. Civil rights attorneys, people who sue for either prison violations or um, abuse by police, that thing, shootings, that kind of thing. They're usually very high profile because they like that because they get more cases that way. So they're usually easy to find and those they'll be willing to talk to you. Sentencing policy experts definitely talk to the Sentencing Project. They are another huge organization, millions of dollars, all experts on all sorts of sentencing issues. Journalists cover this all the time. You could call me. I can tell you like more, who you could talk to. I give quotes all the time because of my lived experience. And then also data from court records. There's something that I've noticed recently that court systems are getting wise about this and they are actually have a data team that can crunch numbers and you could go to them and say like how many people are actually accused of this, how many are convicted, what are the rates that, is this an unusual case? And they have these, data quant people who want to like help that they have that data and you just have to contact them, but they don't publish it for I don't know why. And sometimes maybe takes them a couple days to crunch some numbers, but look for the whatever the court system that you're covering, look for their data team if they have one. If they don't, go the next step up. So like if you're covering like a county court or a little circuit court, go to the state and see what the state has for that. If the state doesn't have it, go to federal and see what, you'd say this is different. I'm covering a state case, but on the federal level, this is how often this happens, that kind of thing. Those are really important. Um, I would say it's necessary context to telling the true story of a criminal case. All right, how do you expand the coverage? How do you do this? Like, if you don't already know about a case, how would you find one, right? So one place you can do that is, how would you find a story if you are like within a case, if you know what's pending in a courtroom? You can go into the court and see the pretrial negotiation papers that are filed. A lot of that is private, but anything that's filed, like an offer that's rejected, that kind of thing, that'll be in papers in the state courts. Motions where defendants are either trying to suppress evidence or whatever, seeing how this plays out before either a plea or a trial. Look at those. All of that stuff gives you a lot of different nuance to the story, and it actually may take the story in a totally different direction. If someone's charged with murder and the prosecutors are offering them probation, the case is probably pretty weak, and that might be a story in itself, but also like maybe a suggestion you should go a little bit further as to how this happened, that this person is charged with that, and without the prosecutors being willing to just drop it. Plea bargains. That's like when you hear that there's a plea bargain. This is something I wrote about last year. In a lot of court records, it just says guilty and it was by plea, but there are a lot of different types of pleas. There's the regular guilty plea where the person says, yes, you're right, I did it, and the plea enters. And there's the nolo contendere, which is Latin for I don't contest any of this, which basically is I'm not saying anything, just act like I'm not here and just enter that conviction or that the verdict and then the conviction against me. And then there's something called an Alford plea, which if you probably if you're going to do this beat, worth a little bit of investigation. It's 55 years old. For the past 55 years, you were allowed to go into court and say, I did not do this crime, but I am pleading guilty solely for the purpose of avoiding the trial penalty. What I talked about before, that kind of enhanced penalty that you get if you roll the dice with trial. So it allows you to factually maintain that you are innocent while also saying, I'm not going to play this game with the prosecution because if I lose, I could go away for a lot longer than I wanted to. So that's really important. And a lot of times that takes either sitting in court during the plea session, which will always be noted, somewhere in court records when that is. Either if you go to court that day, it'll say like what it is, when they post the names of the cases that will be heard that day. A lot of times it's online. So plea sessions are really important, and they also might point you in a different direction of what the real story is there. Um, and then if it does get to a point where there's a sentencing hearing, right? Pay attention to what the defendant is arguing at sentencing. Mitigation is the official term. Like what excuses and reasons is the defendant offering of why he or she shouldn't get a severe sentence? Is it a history of abuse? Is there, substance abuse problem? Whatever it happens to be, what are they offering in mitigation? I think that's a key part of every uh, case. I mean, I don't know of any, it's actually malpractice and ineffective assistance of counsel for a defense attorney not to offer anything in mitigation when someone is being sentenced. So look at that. That's a story very often, and it's also a lot of times a key part of the case that you're covering. And then also the appropriateness for probation and incarceration. There are actually a number of people who have been convicted of sexual offenses and then were not sentenced to incarceration, even despite their severity, because judges were concerned about their safety in prison. And they said, probation is better. I'm not sending you to a certain death where the other prisoners will kill you if they learn about what you've been convicted of out here. So that's actually a common, far more common than you would think, where judges say, "I'm just not going to do it." And the question of whether that's appropriate or not would be another story. And to talk to experts about that would be, I think, very useful for the community. Appeals, appellate records, they tend to be very dry. There can't be any new facts. It's just whether the judge made a mistake or not in all, in how he or she called balls and strikes, allowing this evidence, not allowing this, that kind of thing. So I don't know that they're that exciting in that respect, but the story there might be how attorneys are changing. A lot of people run out of money, so they have to go to a public defender for appeals, things like that. How that person's life has been changed by the criminal prosecution. Also, constitutional issues. Any case that's brought up, if a defendant appeals something and normally it just goes to the appellate level, but it automatically gets advanced to the Supreme Court of the state or the whatever jurisdiction it is, that means that there's a constitutional issue at least at stake, right? I'm not saying it's anything unconstitutional happened, but it raises the stakes. And following that, and then maybe noticing a trend might be a story that you could follow. Post conviction is actually appeals are part of post conviction work, but there's a whole world of post conviction work after someone is convicted and the sentence is imposed, where people still try to fight their convictions. They try to have it overturned. The most common one for post conviction that's not an appeal is called habeas corpus. That's Latin for you have the body. It's basically arguing that someone's punishment is illegal for a variety of reasons. That's where ineffective assistance of counsel comes in. New evidence that has come up that the trial lawyer didn't know about, that comes in there. It can't come in an appeal. Missing evidence, that kind of stuff, that's all in a habeas. So a habeas is going to have a lot of drama, right? Like it's going to have, who's lying, who's all that kind of stuff. That kind of story is going to come out in a habeas. And then there are two levels of habeas for every case, state habeas and federal. So there's actually habeas can take forever. They can take 20 years to get through all the various steps of it. Also look into whether or not there's a local conviction integrity unit for the jurisdiction you're covering. They're supposed to be looking after whether, even if someone has exhausted all of their court opportunities, habeas, appeals, everything, there are still evidence that maybe this conviction is not just. From experience, I know that these organizations are not terrific, that like they're not very good about overturning convictions. The rates are very low, and a lot of defense attorneys are very suspicious of them. That's an important part if you're following somebody who's trying to undo a conviction. And then also like parole and probation statuses. Um, Probation violations will be heard in court. That's part of the case. But parole violations will be heard in the kind of prison apparatus of like what it's basically like you got in trouble as you were in prison. You just happened to be living outside. Those can be viewed by the outside. It's not hard. It's just you'd have to go through the prison to find out how. And most of those are done virtually because the person is inside. 5 minutes left. All right, I'm running out of time here. So, um, all right, and finding them. So if you're looking for stories and you don't have one, but you want to find one, reverse search a criminal defense attorney, the appearances that he or she has in various cases in the court records if you can. So say you know that there's a local hotshot criminal defense attorney and you want to find out where he or she is, who they're representing, usually by their bar number, or they have just name searches on a lot of court websites. Find out what other cases they have. If there's, there might be a beauty of a story in a case, a tiny case that they're representing someone in that just hasn't gotten any kind of attention yet. Cold call criminal defense attorney offices, these people, because that's how they get notoriety and their name out to the public. They will almost always talk to you about either cases they're working on, but also cases that they've heard about. So like they'll always, I don't know of any criminal defense attorney, especially when it's a cold call where someone's just saying, hey, I'm looking for a case to cover. They will talk to you. Sit and watch a court for the whole day. And I don't mean like a couple minutes. I mean, go in at 9 and stay until it closes down, and you will see so many different things. It would actually probably be a very excellent education, but also you're going to see, you'll probably have to choose what you want to track down and follow up on. And the good thing is that the people are there. So you can track, if you want to run out after an attorney or even a defendant, if they're willing to talk to you, you can get access to them right there. You don't have to track them down. And then also, if you want to contact the courts, every court system has a comms person or a PIO and asked to be put on a mailing list for press conferences. For the most part, unless it's a high profile case, there's not press conferences. But sometimes on these weird cases, they actually do hold one. Make sure you're on the list for that so that you know and you can go to it. I know that a couple of times that there have been state cases where they've held them and no one came because no one knew. So they're pretty rare, but make sure that you're on the list ahead of time. Um, if you want to find somebody who's on parole or probation, go to the office. You can look it up, the local parole or probation office. Go there, and usually people are waiting outside because they don't want to wait inside where they're being observed. So just ask people, hey, can I talk to you? Are you on probation or parole? I would say half of the people are going to be willing to talk to you. Um, and that's great for feature stories, people who've been through the system, right? That person is on the kind of tail end of their experience. So they're going to have a lot to say. And their individual story or people they know, they can refer you to them. And then police stations are a great place to find people who are going through this. Now, many police people who are leaving prison, they've ended their sentence is over, the charges were dropped, whatever. If they're leaving prison, we have this kind of understanding that people come and pick them up. That's possible, but for the most part, because many of the people in the system are indigent and can't afford that or don't have that support, they're dropped off at a certain police station in the area and that's how they're released. Don't call the police station or the prison and say, when do you drop off or where do you drop off? Just talk to people and find out, what time. It's usually the same day, it's same time every day, and a bus pulls up and they let people out, and then just go and talk to them and say, hey, can I talk to you? Why were you in? Whatever, that kind of thing. Offer to buy them breakfast because it's usually in the morning. That's a great place to go. And then also find a bondsman and say, hey, who are you bonding out? And talk to them because they're another good source of stories because they're always in courts making sure that the people they've bonded are there, and they also check on they're they're actually posting the bond in the police station so they know what's going on too. That's another way to find stories. Building better habits, right? Questions for the newsroom. If you're going to do this type of coverage, have a checklist, right? Have you made sure that you're differentiating between arrest, charge, conviction, verdict, that kind of thing? Does every person who's named need to be named? And what's the public interest? Who are you protecting if you're not putting the name? Have you quoted one source outside of law enforcement or prosecution? Again, as I listed them, there are places you can go. If it's not going to be the defendant or their attorney, there's tons of other places to go. If you're covering the arrest, am I planning? Oops, am I planning to cover the whole thing? Sometimes you don't know, to be honest. You may think you are, but then you get pulled off and to do something else. But keep that in mind. Is it a worthwhile case that would be followed all the way through? Look at your language. Does it editorialize guilt, character, something about a neighborhood, something about a charge, anything like that? Consider how the story will age. That goes under, like, if you're covering the rest, how it goes through. And would you cover the crime the same way if the parties were different races or classes, or if you didn't have a personal bias against the actual action that's being accused, i.e., a sex crime? Like, we are generally disgusted by those kinds of actions, those allegations? If are you repelled by that? Are you being fair to the person? And is the headline consistent with the nuance of the story? All right. And then I have just see these are just a few discussion prompts. I know a lot of people here might be doing freelance stuff. Do you have a written policy on naming suspects, or at least do you have your own framework? Did you do an audit on who you quote in crime coverage? Have you checked how many sources are from law enforcement or outside? That's a good thing to do. That's what USA Today did, and that's what resulted in or Gannett did to change their coverage. How do we handle the follow-up when charges are dropped? Do you do a correction or another story? And what stories aren't we covering because they don't fit our crime template? And that's why I gave you all those other places to find other stories, because if you're just covering arrests and kind of sensational, like, oh, this person's in trouble, there are plenty of other stories that are really wonderful, really necessary to be told, and you can find them easily. So I think we'll just end there. It depends on you how we understand what's happening in the crimes in criminal courts. I am here as I think Bella and the people at SBJ will give you my contact information if you didn't get it first. It's on this slide deck, and it's the job, guys. It's not a burden. Thank you for your time. I wish we had had more time for questions. If you want to send me a Bella, can we have them send an email or something like that now?
Yeah, sure. If you wanna, I can put your email in the chat, or if you have access to that, if you wanna throw that in there, or it was on the
I'll put
front
it in.
line.
Yep. If
Yeah.
anyone has like something that needs to be answered like now or tonight, I am standing by.
Great. Yeah, perfect. So I'll just leave it up for a minute, and I'll
Okay.
stop the recording.
Thanks, everyone.